The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host.
Hi, my name is Anna Kampenek. I'm the Director of Global Programs at CIPE, and it is my pleasure to host CIPE's Democracy That Delivers podcast today. Our topic is exploring innovative anti-corruption training. And it is a very important topic since over the years, organizations all over the world have attempted various new ways to encourage individuals and businesses to adhere to global anti-corruption standards and legal frameworks. However, as we all know, those efforts are not always fruitful. Often met with some resistance, in part because of prevailing notions in many countries that, well, that's just how the business is done, or everyone else does it, or corruption is just an accepted way of making a living or providing for one's family. This highlights the fact that anti-corruption standards and legal frameworks by themselves, although certainly very important, are not necessarily sufficient to fight corruption. We need other approaches and other incentives, especially among businesses in countries where corruption is widespread, to have a new mindset and to actually affect change. It is my pleasure today to welcome to the podcast somebody who is extremely well positioned to provide some insights along those lines. Dr. Maximilian Burger-Scheidlin, or Max, if I may call you that. Hi,
Yes.
How are you doing?
Hi.
Dr. Burger-Scheidlin joined us from Vienna, Austria, where he's the executive director of the International Chamber of Commerce. And we'll be talking about an innovative program that he has been leading at ICC Austria, focused precisely on new approach, a new way to structure and think about anti-corruption training program. Let's dive right into that. So, Max, I know that in the anti-corruption world, many practitioners come to it from the legal background or compliance background. I know you have a law degree, but I also know that the bulk of your professional experience is very much on the business side, I would think, more than on the legal side. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how that background shape your thinking about effective ways and not so effective ways to fight corruption?
Thank you, Anna. Well, after my legal studies, my first job has been something totally different, selling machinery in Sudan, Ethiopia, etc. Quite corrupt countries at the time. And at that time, also corruption has been tax deductible in Austria and in most of Europe. So as a new guy, I advise companies how to bribe best. So I have been corrupt. And I promoted corruption because that's the way it was done at the time. And until I met a Sudanese businessman who imported some construction machinery, bricks and tile machinery from Austria, and he was running around the market and said, I never bribe. And to start with, I thought, he's cuckoo. How can he make possibly money in this very corrupt market saying, I never bribe? And then I watched him. And the average corruption margin at the time was something like 20% of the value of the machine. Half of it he took to increase his own profits. And the other half he took and set up a fantastic technical after-sales service in the market, much better than his competition. And at the end of the year, with the non-corrupt, these machineries were down, let's say, a week, 10 days for repair in a year. And the machinery serviced by the corrupt purchasers, these machinery were down partly 2 to 3 months a year because spare parts were hard to get, had to be imported from Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands with a long delay. And with this, the most corrupt purchasers realized, if my machinery is not working, no profits. And that for me was a wake-up call that things can be very, very different. It's not only, you don't have to look only at gaining the order, selling a machine, what happens afterwards. So with a little bit of an extended timeline. And for me, after that wake-up call, I really started doing different things and looking at the whole problem of corruption very differently. And then after Sudan, I worked in the Philippines, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and God knows where. And I realized and saw abject poverty. And I realized a lot of it is rooted in corruption. And that's why over time, not from today to tomorrow, I changed my mindset. Now, the classic, as you mentioned at the beginning, the classic approach to fight corruption is legal and compliance anti-corruption. In short, it says you must not bribe, otherwise you go to prison. Well, the reaction of corrupt individuals in these countries with high corruption levels is, well, how can I feed my family? How can I be successful? And by the way, in my country, everybody does it. And by the way, I've braved my policeman in the past, and the public prosecutor might be from the same tribe, the judge a neighbor. So I have nothing to fear. So why should I go along with this Western notion of non-corruption? What a nonsense. So the point is, everybody in the high corrupt markets, with this anti-corruption drives we're doing at present, fears of losing money. So from my point of view, money is the key, and we should talk money to the presently corrupt. It is not lawyers who do most of the bribing, it is businessmen. So let us talk a business language, which is increase profits, reduce risks, reduce losses. And that's why we created this commercial approach to anti-corruption. Anna.
So you made a couple of really important points. First, that in many countries, even though laws may be on the books concerning anti-corruption, the enforcement is lacking, including in many Western countries regarding foreign corruption. So in the US, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed in the 70s, but wasn't really enforced until much, much later. And as you mentioned, in many countries also, for certain forms of corruption were legal also until fairly recently. So the notion of what is sort of acceptable conduct in international business has been evolving for the better. The other important point I wanted to reemphasize is incentives, right? So whatever they are, whether it's financial incentives on the positive side or being put to jail on the negative side, incentives matters, and how we shape them will help shape behavior. So let's talk about the solution that you came up with based on your extensive international experience, as you mentioned, in some rather difficult markets. So I first heard you speak about the training program you developed earlier this year at the World Chambers Congress in Geneva, Switzerland. And I was very intrigued by your presentation, which was one of the finalists in the chamber competition, because anti-corruption is just not necessarily a topic that comes up a whole lot with the chambers of commerce in particular. We at SIPE, try to do our part and help make it a topic of conversations, and what constructive role chambers can play to help shape the incentives and help affect business behavior on the ground. So tell us a little bit more about your program. How did you come up with it? I think you already started explaining to us a little bit how it's different from other anti-corruption training that our audience may be familiar with.
Well, our headlines are not life-threatening or profit reduction. Our headline is increase your profits, reduce risks, maximum your income, but over your lifetime, and avoid corruption. So the reaction of individuals, corrupt individual, is curiosity, not antagonism. Well, let us listen, let us consider. What we try to do is enhance self-serving egoism of business people, but extend the timeline from, let's say, next quarterly profit to over 20 years profit maximization. And with the extension of the timeline, risk and risk reduction becomes extremely important. So we ask for, or we push for a mindset change and not poverty. An example from China. I made a presentation at the Steel Traders Association. We had a 2 hours time, and after 20 minutes of my introduction, I asked the audience if they have any first questions. And I had a fiery reaction from the Secretary General, a lady, who said, "Max, you're all wrong. If we follow you, we all go bankrupt." And I thought, wow, baff, I missed it. Then the president of the association got up, also a lady, and said, "Max, fantastic. Now I know exactly what to do differently and avoid corruption and maximize my profits." And for the next hour and a half, these two ladies started fighting. And the whole room started fighting. And at the end, roughly 75% were pro-corruption and 25% were against corruption. Well, not that I can say, well, I have won the argument. No, but I've planted a virus. And I'm sure after these sessions, at the pub, at the, invitations, the conversation, the discussion, the fighting would go on. And I think that's so important, to plant the virus that things can be done differently. Or an example from Tajikistan, where I made a presentation, and a few months later, a businessman attending my session wrote to me and said, "Max, fantastic. 3 weeks after you departed, people from the Ministry of Finance came and for inspection. De facto, they wanted money. I used your arguments, they went away. A month later, they came again. Another argument, they went away. 2 months later, they came again. Third time. I used your arguments, they went away. Well, he said, I don't know if by chance next time they come, they will twist my hand that much that I will come up and pay. But hooray, hooray, I never knew that I could win 3 rounds against these bastards." So again, there's a virus which I planted. I cannot tell you and cannot measure how far that went. But what I think we have to do, all of us, plant viruses like this, try to push for a different mindset.
That's an interesting framing. I guess the good pandemic, hopefully, yeah, it's a very good point that oftentimes and your standard anti-corruption training is too theoretical, or just stops at, well, just say no, or just don't pay the bribe, but it fails to account for realities on the ground. So the type of training you suggested, helping people think for practical scenarios, how can they actually resist corruption, is very important. It's something that at SIPE we've incorporated as well in our work, sometimes including very simple, very practical tools, like almost like a comic book, for instance, that draws up a certain scenario. Inspector comes to your store or to your business. What do you do? How do you resist? So that's a super important point. Make it practical, give people tools, and plant that seed of thinking things can be done differently. Tell us a little bit more about the scope of the training program, how many countries you've done it in, and also who is the target audience? Is it chambers, associations, individual businesses, a mix of them?
Well, in the past, most of the audience have been business people at the age of between 35 to 50. So some smaller business owners or mid-sized business owners, no CEOs of big corporations, but let's say the middle class brass, which really goes to the front lines. And I have been invited in the past by various national committees of the ICC, from Indonesia to Argentina. I've done it for Austrian chambers. I've been invited by the European Union before the war to Syria. I've been doing it for the UNODC in Serbia, for the EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Uzbekistan, for the Siemens Integrity Initiative, for example, in China, for some law firms in Russia, Brazil, and Ukraine, for universities in Hungary and Kazakhstan. So a bit Max background, who asked me to join in, but the audience were always business people. Some had jobs in the chamber in addition, but few were full-time employees of the chamber.
And especially with business people, as you mentioned earlier, the focus on, the bottom line. How do we operate cleanly but still retain our ability to conduct business is at the forefront. And the point you made earlier about sort of extending the time horizon is key. I think we are seeing it a lot more also in at least larger companies, how they think about the greatest area of risk, corruption risk in conducting business, which is sales, right? In most places, traditionally, sales targets have been just that. You're given a sales target, no questions asked how you achieve it, or few questions asked, and also the timeline tend to be traditionally fairly tight. Whereas an approach where you maybe adjust the metrics, adjust the incentives for sales, people can make a big difference. Has that been your experience?
Time is a key issue. And as you correctly said, most timelines, or let's say sales targets, have a very narrow timeline. And many sales managers get an incentive once a contract is signed. The problem is that in most corporations, you have three different timelines. One is usually 1 year timeline for the sales manager. You have an average of, let's say, 2 to 4 years timeline for the CEO. And then you have a third timeline, which is the timeline of the owner, who doesn't care about the signature on the contract. He wants a profit at the end of the day. And that might be in let's say, if you talk about machinery and plant engineering, after 10 years, after all the possible law and compliance things and legal cases are settled. So we have three different timelines, and that is the problem. I think ideally we should have only one timeline, and that is that of the owner. Now, my suggestion, we should give sales managers not just a little incentive, but a giant incentive, but only to be paid out after perhaps 5 years. It could be double, triple, quadruple as high as today. I'll give you one example from China. We advised a factory which did a kind of hydraulic ladders for fire brigades. And as they had a corrupt purchasing manager for steel, they didn't buy the right quality steel. So at the end of the day, these ladders slowly sank down. The problem, a fire brigade went to a fire with, let's say, hundreds of people watching, perhaps a few journalists. Very bad PR when this ladder of the fire brigade slowly went down and people couldn't be rescued. Now, the legal approach would say fire the purchasing manager and sue him for damages. The commercial approach, which I advocate, very different. Our analysis showed that roughly 1/3 of all staff has been somehow engaged in repairs, from kind of technical repairs to taking complaints or whatever it is. So we set up a bonus system for all. Payout with a delay of 18 months on condition of perfect quality and no corruption. the average time between purchasing a spare parts and delivery to the fire brigade was 6 months. So we had 3 times the timeline. And in the end result, quality increased dramatically, and we could pay out a bonus of 1 year extra salary to each person in the factory, each year. So a win-win situation for all. Quality increased, salaries doubled, reputation went up. Because the reputation went up, the profits, the sales went up, also to neighboring cities, etc., and therefore the profits of the owner increased. So things can be done so that everybody wins.
And that's the message. So, speaking of messaging, let's talk a little bit more about branding for anti-corruption training and some pitfalls and lessons there. So, in SIPE's experience around the world, obviously corruption is a very touchy subject, and if you create a training or a workshop and call it an anti-corruption training, you send an invitation, but then nobody shows up. Why might that be? Well, again, the phrase itself makes people stop and think, well, or they might say, well, are you implying I'm corrupt? That's why, why should I come to this workshop? Or even if I am, I wouldn't admit it. So there's definitely a branding issue with the sort of anti-corruption forward approach to training. In our experience, messaging along the lines you mentioned, how can you increase profit sustainably? How can you manage risk? How can you protect reputation? Work much better. So give us a sense, and again, the breadth of your experience in different countries, different cultures, different regions. What messaging works to bring people to the training?
On the negative side, Anna, you're absolutely correct. What you described right now exactly happened to colleagues of mine in Malaysia. They set up a big anti-corruption seminar with top speakers from reputable anti-corruption organizations like Transparency International and others, and almost nobody showed up. And in the end, they realized, well, business have been fearful that whoever would ask questions at the seminar would be reported by Transparency International Malaysia to the police.
That's a big concern.
So nobody came. And that's why I use no legal issue. I just look positive keywords, although at an extended timeline. Increase profits, reduce risk, safety and security for your family, higher income, but at a longer time period. That's what I use. And I think to be successful in difficult countries, you need the positive enforcement. And after my presentation in Geneva, the chair of a Nigerian chamber came running after me and said, Max, fantastic. We've been trying anti-corruption for the last 15 years. Nothing worked. We got just negative responses. But your commercial approach to anti-corruption, that might be the solution.
That's been our experience as well in countries around the world. How do we know, though, that we're making a difference? I mean, measuring the impact of training is hard. You mentioned some examples. Let's dive into that a little bit more. Do you hear back from people who tell you, yes, this really made a difference. I'm operating my business differently.
The problem is what I've seen in many countries, that although I'm delivering my message in English language, many of the audience have difficulties expressing themselves in English. Very often we have a translator locally present. And that, of course, let's say, makes the feedback more difficult. And what we need to do is go into an area, into a city, into whatever it is, just not once, but more often. I don't know, once a year or whatever it is, to, in the same area, reinforce the message and get a kind of an extended audience and following to the new idea to the, let's say, the positive idea. I know that it needs money. I know that they need staff. Yes, I have a small team to support me, but we are far too small to roll out a global program continuously. And I've tried to liaise with big organizations, multinational organizations, and they're all run by lawyers. Uh, I had a very negative feedback from these official programs of OECD, OSCE, etc., because lawyers say we must do legal and compliance. And they simply have no experience on the front lines and do not understand or don't want to think outside the box to look at the commercial approach to anti-corruption. And if you talk about profits to a UN or, let's say, international organization guy, he starts to be very hesitant. Don't want to support big business. He doesn't realize that 95% of all businesses are small or medium-sized.
Absolutely. And business can only be a business if there's profit. If there's no profit, there's no business.
Exactly.
So that is an interesting point. And of course, training as such, as you said, it does require follow up to really be able to gauge impact over time. In most trainings, when you ask the participants, I mean, unless a trainer was terrible, they will tell you, yes, it was a very interesting training. I learned a lot. I'll do something useful with it. But it's really from the perspective of several months or years, if you come back to them, or perhaps they reach out to you, is that you sort of get some idea of what they actually did with the knowledge. So perhaps, we talked about the metaphor of a virus before, but maybe another image could be planting a seed, and then you have to go back and water the seed every so often and hopefully watch the plant grow.
Exactly. And over time, you need then the trainers program to really roll it out in the country. You can't do it from any headquarter in the Western world. You have, in the end, you have to have local trainers who carry on the message.
Absolutely. And for SIPE, that's the approach we're using in Africa, for instance, where we have developed a network of local trainers who understand the local realities. Yes, they understand compliance and legal issues, but they have that practical touch. They obviously are able to speak the local language, and that makes a big difference. Speaking of training trainers, how are you thinking about the sustainability of your program? Are you yourself training others to do it? And also any words of advice in our closing minutes that you may have to another Chamber of Commerce or business associations who may want to conduct similar training?
For example, I just mentioned the Nigerian chamber before. I just had an email exchange with them today, and I did send them some papers yesterday, and enthusiastic feedback, and said, well, we're now discussing it not only in the local chamber, but in the Federation of Nigerian Chambers, because we have to do something, because otherwise we just go belly down. We cannot sustain Nigerian business except for a few giant big men. But we have all the opportunities here. We need to do it differently. So from my point of view, I'm ready to put in my work time, and I'm happy to strengthen that perhaps. But of course, I would be very happy to have partners like SIPE or others who carry on the message and who have a big local, global program in difficult countries. You remember that I talked to your colleague Lola in Nigeria in April this year, and we had a very good rapport.
Lola is our country director in the Nigeria office.
So I think what I can do is talk to the multitude of Lolas around the world at SIPE, and let's go it and really let's talk to the difficult countries and I mean, one giant operation will have to be delivered in Ukraine, I think, where you're active too. And at some time, the war will end. Ukraine has been one of the most corrupt countries, at least up to 2014. It has improved a little bit since then. But if you have a giant reconstruction program and you don't want all the money to end up in Dubai, we have to do a lot beforehand about anti-corruption or non-corruption.
Absolutely, agreed. And it really takes a global effort and networks of reformers, trainers, organizations working together in different ways. Um,
Let me
in our Yeah, go ahead.
let me briefly come back to chambers, which you mentioned before. I think there's a real business case for chambers, a huge opportunity. Uh, on the one hand, for chambers to make money, for chambers to become more important and powerful, and to establish trust. The problem is uh, corruption always favors one party, and it diminishes trust between businesses, between business and the chamber, between business and the government and everybody. So the key point for the chamber is to somehow re-establish trust, and for a chamber to roll out now against money, against fees, a training program and a consultancy program to really help their local businesses if asked for a bribe, can do wonders for the financial positive income generation for chambers, at the same time building trust.
Absolutely, and that's something we also emphasize to our partners in the chamber and association world, that practical anti-corruption training can actually be a great source of revenue for the chamber as a service. Absolutely. Um, Last final question, as we're running out of time. Obviously, the topic is vast. We could spend another hour probably talking about it. Um, Corruption is somewhat of a depressing topic, right? It sometimes feels like Sisyphus pushing a big boulder up the hill, uh, but you've been doing it for so many years. You clearly have the passion and enthusiasm for a different world, a world where corruption is not the norm of conducting business. So, what um, gets you up in the morning? What gives you optimism looking into the future that positive change on a global scale when it comes to fighting corruption is possible?
Well, it's hope and knowledge both. I'm a born optimist. Let's put it this way, right or wrong. And what drives me partly is a negative point. I've seen so much hopelessness, poverty, desperation, destitution in countries, and I consider most of it not necessary. I've done, for example, a lot of work in Syria before the war. And I've been with economic advisors to President Assad in 2003. And I told them, well, if you don't upgrade your economy, give youngsters hope, we had at that time 60% youth unemployment, you will have an implosion. So when I look around the globe, I mean, from Boko Haram in Nigeria, even partly to the Russian-Ukraine war, if people would have acted differently in advance, might be these civil wars would not have been there. And look at two countries in Africa next to each other, Mauritius Island and Madagascar. At the end of the colonization, the incomes in Mauritius Island were double as high as Madagascar. Today, the difference is 18 times. Mauritius did something against corruption, Madagascar nothing. So you see, over time, there's a powerful possibilities to bring people out of desperation, hunger, God knows what. if we would just do the right thing at the right time and not always spread the negative message of you must not bribe, but spread the positive message, increase your income, reduce your risks with a commercial approach to anti-corruption.
Absolutely, and I think it's a crucial and a great closing point that sometimes becomes obscure. Fighting corruption, it's not just about complying with some law for the sake of complying with the law. It is ultimately about supporting inclusive economic growth, access to opportunity, lasting peace, issues that are really fundamental to building prosperous democracies. May we all share in your optimism on that front. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today. And we definitely look forward to staying in touch, as I'm sure our work will intersect in many countries around the world going forward. Dr. Maximilian Burger-Scheidlin, thank you so much. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Listen and subscribe to SIPE's Democracy That Delivers, wherever you get your podcasts.